Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I've told my father I am going to take some classes at the seminary, so give him another round of applause. I, like many of you, have seen the news this past week, and in the spirit of what my father was talking about in 1 Chronicles, 2nd chapter, 32nd verse, you talk about the men of Issachar, this fighting tribe, this gallant group of men and women. I couldn't help but see the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And in my mind's eye, it went back to 1619, all the way to 2019. And this, our 400th anniversary of Africans in the America. When I saw these two great, powerful people on the stage for the world, one representing the Great Britain and the monarchy, and the other, the industrial might and the financial power, the beacon of freedom around the world, the United States of America. When I see these two great forces that have made capitalism spread, that have opened up industry and markets, that have established trade routes, that have superb military and aircraft, that has navigated the globe. 400 years later, English is the standard language that all pilots must speak. You can't be a pilot anywhere in the world if you don't speak English. The dollar is the largest and deepest currency of any currency in the world. These are the things that the British and the Americans have done. When the British came over here and created their colony, they came over for profit, not for freedom. They sent the worst of theirs to come over here so that they too could rape and pillage. But there was a great group to come out of by way of the Pilgrims, those persons that were earnest, the Calvinists that wanted to give and share. But to see that 400 years later of Africans in the America, with these two great persons representing superpowers, do not mention the Africans in the Americas. I bring that up to you because yesterday was a painful day for me. I had to go to a friend's son's funeral. A young man that's done scaffolding work for me and has done tuck pointing. He was carjacked in a south suburban neighborhood and killed. I've been to many funerals. I heard a man preach his funeral one time, and yesterday I heard a young child sing the Lord's Prayer at his own funeral. If our children knew who they were and how we fit on the great stage of life, they wouldn't think to take another child's life over a car. It's 400 years later. And so if the President of the United States doesn't say it, and if the Queen of England doesn't say it, we need a Rainbow Push platform so we can have our own truth to teach. I couldn't help but think 100 years later, from 1919 to 2019, this is the 100th anniversary of the race riots that started right here in Chicago. When an African-American child was swimming in God's lake and went over a rope and he was stoned to death. I couldn't help but think about on Normandy and D-Day, where the troops were coming in to liberate the French so that they could vote, so that the British could end up having backup power from its former colony, that the persons that were fighting beside them, the men and women, the black men and the white men, was living in segregated barracks, having segregated fountains, segregated toilets, segregated burial grounds. But when the time came, the African-American soldiers stood up once again to fight for the greater good. Why is this important? Because Africans in the Americas have fought in every war we've ever had. Our children need to understand this. When I saw the children at a funeral this past month, Our children, and God bless them, they don't know. I'm not knocking them. I'm talking to the parents right now. Why don't you bring your child in here so they can learn about our civics and our history? When our children don't have a young child called me the other day. He's not a child, he's 35. And he says, Mr. Jackson, I want to sell you something. I said, that's very nice of you. What do you have? And he told me some gadget for a television. I said, I really don't watch that much television. And I assure you, I don't need any more gadgets, any more channels for television. I have the smallest cable bill, and I have the most complex form of bootleg mechanisms to get every channel necessary around the world. That, I was convinced I can do better than him. I'm not buying any movies, music, that's not necessary. Here's my point. He wanted to sell me something, and I said, I'm not interested. He says, Brother Jackson, a friend of mine died, and I just need to make some money so I can buy a suit so I can go to the funeral. A 35-year-old man doesn't have a suit, which is the bigger issue, because there's 52 weeks in the year, Reverend Anderson. You ought to have one to go to church sometime. Our children are like being pushed out of our society. On D-Day, what should we know? These African American soldiers had to make a choice where they were relegated to do the low-life duties. But when it was time to go to the front line, they stood there. And when I see a man that said he had bone spurs, who can't trace anyone in his family's history, genealogy, lineage, back to any war, having sacrificed anything for our country. I think of my grandfather, my father's father, whose name we have, Charles Henry Jackson, who came back from World War II. First, let me tell you how he got to World War II. He had 3 jobs working for one man. Naturally, he couldn't borrow, couldn't own in the part of Greenville, South Carolina he was in. And then one day he tried to talk down to my grandfather in front of another man. My grandfather had a chain of his keys that he had that was the man's to all of his properties that he cleaned in. He says, come over here, Charlie Henry. Boy, I said, come. He says, no, sir, I can't. I got my son here. I'm not doing that. A veteran, a man, a principled man, working a government job and other jobs for this man. Then the man goes on to say, he was so disgusted with my grandfather, he went down to the recruiting office, put his name on the roll to say, go call him. And that's when the government came to pick him up, to put him on the front lines. He was proud to put on the military uniform in spite of it all. But when he came back home into the port of New York, took the train down to Washington, D.C., by the time they got to the Mason-Dixon line, he had to get off of the front of the train. I'm talking about a soldier, an African-American soldier, and had to get to the back of the bus, the back of the train. He had to sit behind the same Nazi prisoners of war that they had just fought in Germany. 400 years, 1619 to 2019. Race riots, 1919 to 2019. 75 years after D-Day. African Americans were fighting for the French's liberation and salvation and their freedom in 44, 21 years before we had the Voting Rights Act in America. I'm talking about 100 years after the Civil War, we still did not have the right to vote. See, American history is complex and it's confusing, but that's the work of the devil, because the truth is the light. History History is not complex and confusing. It only gets that way when people start lying. These men had the courage and the character. But when we don't see ourselves on the stage, when our children don't know we are a part of D-Day, that we fought to liberate people for their right to vote before we had it for ourselves. Yeah. Then there was a 26-year-old student, Dad, who wrote into the African-American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier. And he raised the question, should I go to war and fight to be a half of an American? That prompted those editors to think, and they responded. They said, we must have democracy, but we also must have victory abroad and victory at home. That's where the VV came from, for the victory abroad and the victory at home. Now follow me on this timeline. It was 50 years ago when we started seeing African Americans be able to integrate into some of the classrooms, and we had our voting rights. Dad, this past week I had the honor to be in Decatur, Illinois with young Reverend Courtney Carson. I'm loving Decatur a lot. Because it was 20 years ago in 1999 that we went into that school building. This time I went into that school building not with Governor George Ryan, not with you, Dad, not with the sheriff, not with the superintendent that had kicked the child out of school and denied him any sort of education. I went back there with a college graduate, a young minister that's now the vice president of the school board that denied him an education. I want to say thank you, Dad. They said the child shouldn't go. How does this fit into the context? And the men of Issachar, they had the vision. Sometimes it's hard for us to get the whole picture. This is a national day of recognition that we saw on June 6th for D-Day. We fit in on the D-Day. We still need victory abroad and victory at home. We are watching the documentary of the Central Park Five. They will see us. We need victory abroad and victory at home. We've seen our children get kidnapped. We've seen the President of the United States put a bounty on children's head with no remorse, no apology. So when he does it and says, women, you don't have control of your body. You cannot control your reproductive organs. It's the same vile thought and evil spirit. When we see these young children getting shut up, like Laquan McDonald, it wasn't just one person. There was a crew of officers that lied. And they're still on the force. We are working with Mayor Lightfoot, and I must say how proud I am of her and the work that she's doing. Our children have finished school, graduated, done everything we want, and they're still locked out. And what do some people say? Well, black leadership should have done. The preachers should have done. Jesse Jackson should have done. What are you gonna do? And when are you gonna do it? And why haven't you done anything? I'm looking and seeing these children from all these schools that have closed. Where was our voice when Rahm was on the throne and they were closing the school? I didn't see that many, Rev. In conclusion, my friends, 400 years later, 100 years after the race riots, 75 years after the D-Day, 50 years after we've been fighting to open up these doors economically, 20 years after Decatur, here we are in 2019. We're not going backwards. We have got to go forward. want victory abroad, and we want those same rights bestowed upon us right here in the country that we've lived and born and that we have built. Dad, when I saw that June 6th, and I thought of D-Day, I saw June 6th, 1966. I saw James Meredith starting to walk down in Memphis, going into Mississippi. It was June 6, 1966. Brother James Meredith wanted to have a right and a march for dignity in Mississippi. He wanted to prove that he could be free in the United States of America. And there was a sniper laying in the bush, young Norvell, a white unemployed worker, an assassin. He shot that young man who had opened the doors for higher education for Africans in Mississippi. Thank God that Brother James Meredith is alive and well today, but that's a D-Day when democracy was born and became real.